Welcome to the CSSJ podcast. I'm Jonah Lenahan, CSSJ student worker and resident camp withdrawal victim. You can take the counselor out of the camp, but you can't take the camp out of the counselor.
And I'm Ajla Salkic, CSSJ student worker as well, resident denim barista and iced dirty chai with oat milk enthusiast. Delicious.
Guys, this is unbelievable. We're back for a second season, but the CSSJ is in a really weird place. We've got no director, and we had no staff. Until luckily, a certain genius who writes for the CSSJ podcast managed to go out into the world and handpick the perfect candidates.
Whoa, as if, Jonah, you wish that you had half the mind to pick all of us individually.
I mean, I do feel like I've been in a leadership role recently.
You are not the leadership, Kay. We are a unified force, Kay. You should be thanking your stars that we showed up here to fix this.
And Jonah, last I remember, I approached you about working at the CSSJ, not you to me.
Okay, I feel like this whole revisionist history thing is a little bit of a problem.
That's not really how I remember it. Weren't we eating oranges when I asked you about a job?
I do like a good orange, but I feel like I'm still very much the Nick Fury of this Avengers.
Nick Fury, you are not even Phil Coulson. No, do not oversell yourself.
I don't even watch The Avengers, but I would agree with Ezra.
Okay, guys, this is ridiculous. As you can tell, the new staff is very excited to be here, and so we're now gonna do something that I'm calling a second first date with the CSSJ. I'm giving each one of these loons 5 words to describe themselves.
Starting with me, Ajla, as always. I'm witty, anxiety-riddled, thoughtful, the mom friend, and all of literature.
Myself, Ezra, I would say I'm spiritual, loudmouthed, a nerd, and yeah.
And I'm Etsu. My friends have described me as a listener, a lover of the color red, an avocado enthusiast, and a blend of cinnamon and cardamom.
And of course, I need no introduction. I'm contemplative, I'm folksy, I'm vociferous, I'm flannel, and I am corduroy.
You are like the specter haunting this campus.
Today, I'll be our main interview. Ajla will be interviewing for us as well, a second guest. My guest will be Professor Jodie Vann, who works in the religion department.
And my guest will be Fatima Siddiqui, a student leader here on campus.
We're very excited for all of that, but now I believe it's time for our dear friend Miss Etsub to tell us about some campus events. Etsub, take it away.
I'm Etsub, and I have 2 events to discuss with you today. This Tuesday, the Africana Studies Department hosted a Welcome Back happy hour on the Stern patio. This event was for all Africana Studies majors, minors, and faculty. With Professor Johnson back from her sabbatical, it was a great opportunity for students to connect with professors and plan out events for the upcoming semester. Today, on Thursday, September 12th, the Faculty Research Lunch Series presents There's No Plan B, The Integral Labor of Black Women Educators During the COVID Lockdown Era by Professor Jackie Forbes. During the luncheon, which will be held at the Stern Great Room from 12 to 1, Professor Forbes will discuss how educators' labor became ill-defined and gendered during the global emergency through frameworks of racial capitalism and gendered organizations. Both of these events center Black voices, which are important for the Dickinson community to hear, and I hope you will join. This is your CSSJ correspondent, keeping you in the loop.
Thank you, Etsub. We appreciate you letting us know what's coming up soon. I'm super excited for all the events happening and the upcoming projects for all of our students. In addition to everything Etsub has mentioned, CSSJ is also having a supply drive coming up tomorrow night for Community Cares, which, for those of you who may not know, is a homeless shelter and a halfway house here in Carlisle. Join us in giving back to the community on a Walmart run tomorrow, or bring in unopened goods and toiletry items to Landis House.
We're very, very excited to do some good together for the community. Whether you're religious, secular, or spiritual, this is a great way to give back. Many people find expression of their spirituality and religion through service. It's really important for us to acknowledge that students across the religious, secular, and spiritual spectrum can find a home in religious and spiritual life here at Dickinson. So we have a lot of student groups, we have conversation groups. Ajla, could you maybe give us a fuller picture of what some of those might be?
Sure, I can give you just a handful to start. So we have an Orthodox fellowship that has Bible study on Saturday afternoons. We have Catholic Mass on Sunday. Hillel hosts Shabbat on Fridays. And Mecca has ongoing prayer groups and shared meals throughout the year. But that's obviously just a few. There's a lot more.
We've got Pagan Curious, Dickinson Taoists, religiously redefining. So there's much going on campus.
If interested in any of these events, feel free to reach out to CSSJ and we can direct you to your group of interest.
It's like literally our job. Now, that's religious and spiritual life at Dickinson, and it's always expanding, growing, and changing, but there's another aspect of religion at Dickinson that is a completely different animal, and I'm talking about the Religious Studies Department. I'm a religion major, I love the religion department, but the religion department doesn't really have anything to do with my personal faith. We're talking about the academic study of religion that pays attention to beliefs and practices and history and the way that people talk about and express religion over time. It's a study. It's similar to anthropology or sociology, where we learn about religious traditions throughout the years. Professor Jodie Vann is just one professor in our religious studies department. You may also know Professor Shadler, Professor Lieber, Professor Kahn. Today's main interview is with Professor Vann. Professor Vann has a truly unique biography as it comes to religious studies. Professor Vann primarily focuses on the spiritual but not religious trend in American religious life. This is probably something that you've heard of. It can be a bit complicated to understand, and we're going to dive deep into it with her today. She also spends a lot of time studying New Age faiths, like neo-paganism, which we've seen some of on campus, nature spiritualities, and especially those people who would consider themselves agnostics or seekers of faith or of the divine. We're going to transition now to Professor Jodie Vann. All right, we are joined now by Professor Jodie Vann of Dickinson's Religion Department. Professor Vann, welcome to the CSSJ podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jonah.
I want to begin, Professor Vann, by talking about a trend that we've recently seen in religion in the United States and, frankly, on campus as well. These are the religious nuns, people who don't identify with any one religious tradition. I'm certain that there are students even listening to this who would fall into that camp. What do you think we can attribute the rise in religious disaffiliation to? Where does that come from?
Yeah, there's, I think, a lot of contributing factors. Primarily, what we've seen in the current data is people who are leaving churches, whether it's the churches they grew up in or they're exploring and then choosing none of them. They're not doing so necessarily or very commonly for theological reasons, right? They're not disbelieving in God or having some kind of a crisis of faith. For the most part, they're leaving these churches because of political issues, because of social concerns, issues like sexual and gender identity, racism. Those are really common things that people will attribute their dissatisfaction and eventual disassociation from their churches.
Yeah, I know that I've personally spoken to a lot of students who identify with the community of church or even with certain theological ideas or faith, but they feel like they can't be a part of the community anymore because of religious trauma in the background or perceived issues within that church community. You've talked a lot about the trend towards spiritual but not religious, people who are somewhat theistic or have a concept of the divine or something beyond the observable, but they don't align themselves with a tradition. What does that look like for those people? And is there any way that we can help to understand our fellow students who are spiritual but not religious?
So this is a really important issue, and this is where I do most of my current research. I'm actually working on a project now that's exploring the kind of historical turn when that claim to be spiritual but not religious becomes viable. So I'm sure you know, Jonah, that spirituality as a concept has existed in Christianity and other religions for a long, long time. But the idea of separating spirituality from those institutions, from that tradition, is really a contemporary phenomenon. The work that I'm doing is trying to attribute that sort of shift to some changes that are happening in the late 1980s, early 90s. We see a massive rise in access to media and new technologies, with access to new information, to seeing how different people live in the world. It becomes harder for a lot of people to buy into one tradition fully. So we start to see people kind of piecing together different religious elements. Somebody really likes the figure of Jesus and what he represents from Christianity, but they like the practice of meditation and the image of the Buddha. So we start to see some kind of mixing together. I think one of the things that facilitates this is this liberal turn toward recognizing all of humans as we're all one species. Now, I'm not contesting that, but I think what we have to consider is that on some level that allows for people to borrow outside of traditions and maybe even problematic appropriation when we don't recognize that historical and cultural context matters. I think that for the people who identify as spiritual but not religious, there's a tendency to want to have the freedom to individualize their identity. The only authority for many of the people that I have worked with is themselves. It's not a text, it's not a tradition, it's not a church. The only one who has the final say in what is real and authentic is the person speaking. And so I think that kind of individualistic turn is really essential to understand the SBNR.
Thank you. That's very insightful. I think the individualistic view of religion fascinates me. I wasn't raised in a place where religion was thought of as individual. I'm curious. You have also spent a great deal of time looking into non-traditional traditional faiths and spiritualities that do form communities. Could you describe some of your experiences with such people and groups and give us your process for teaching a class like cults and communes?
So unfortunately, I haven't had the chance to join a cult quite yet, but I have had some opportunities in my research to spend time with these coalesced spiritual communities. One example, I spent a lot of time during my dissertation research in Glastonbury, England, which is this wild and weird little town out in the middle of nowhere in southwest England, known for its music festival, but it also has a vibrant community of Christian pilgrimage, druids, there's a local Buddhist temple, and I got the opportunity to spend some time there with the Hare Krishnas. They are a group that emerged in the 60s and 70s as a somewhat new interpretation of Hindu cosmology. And the fascinating thing about the group that I worked with in England was how incredibly diverse it was. Small town England, the leader of the community was himself a white British man, but there were people from Nepal who came to England for this practice. There were people who came from India, but what I found was that even people who see themselves as the final authority want to seek confirmation and validation from others who share similar, if not completely the same, worldviews and experiences. One of the key kind of characteristics, and this is something I have seen, and scholars have also identified this, that within the spiritual but not religious, the emphasis for most people is on experience. Primary, direct, personal experience. And these groups help facilitate that, but they also give people a chance to talk things through after the experience and make sense of those. So even though the individual is the primary authority, humans crave and demand community. So I think we see that in these kind of really unique little pop-up communities that I saw.
I'm curious if there's any connection between sort of the born-again Christian movement, which also focuses a lot on personal experience, relationship with Jesus, having that born-again moment. And that's a big thing in American Christianity right now. Is there a connection for you between Christians who think of themselves as born-agains and then these much more divergent nature spiritualities or people who profess to be Hare Krishnas, also based upon a personal experiential idea of the divine?
I think there's absolutely something to be said in the American streams of spirituality. If we think back historically to kind of monumental spiritual thinkers like Emerson or Thoreau, these were men who were writing of spirituality in a way that was kind of foreshadowing the SBNR, but spirituality hadn't been completely disentangled from religion at that point. Going back historically helps to kind of frame this because there's the monumental shifts in American religious history that scholars have kind of identified as major turning points in how religion broadly has been understood and practiced. In the early 19th century, the Second Great Awakening was the first time really where Christianity became about a powerful emotional experience for the believer, right? Where that became essential for that kind of conversion. And now that is generally amongst many evangelical Christians considered absolutely essential to salvation. This is a new thing that has developed, and I think there's certainly intersections with the way in which evangelicals have also filtered Christianity and all of the myths, the stories, the morals, the ethics, the history. They filter that through this modern lens of individual. That's not a bad thing. It's just a thing that we have to be aware of, that religion is shifting in response to how society in general understands the person.
It's become increasingly clear for us in the United States, and especially me as somebody in a mainline Protestant denomination, that evangelicalism has risen as a very culturally accepted and large branch of Christianity in the United States and in many other places around the world. Of course, there's political tension and there's disagreement theologically, but the evangelical movement is well established. In observing some more fringe religious groups, whether those be neo-pagans, New Age spiritualities, do you believe that an increase in their prevalence, openness will lead to greater cultural and social acceptance, or do you feel that by the very nature of those communities they will exist on the margins?
I think the fact that data is indicating that the increase in the population that is identifying as spiritual but not religious, or none, or atheist, somewhere on that spectrum of not one of these official institutional churches. In the 80s, in this period where I'm sort of investigating this shift, data says maybe about 5% of the US population population was somewhere in that kind of domain. And right now, we're looking at close to 30%, with almost 50% of Gen Z kind of falling into that category. So historically, we've seen a massive shift in what I think of as the kind of social viability of the claim. The fact that people can say, I'm spiritual but not religious, and you understand what they're saying, even if people don't agree on what that means, we all kind of get the references that are built into that. Because the population of evangelicals in the US is a very stable demographic, particularly religiously, right? We see a lot of shifting in other communities. Growth amongst the spiritual but not religious, growth amongst the atheists and agnostics, major decreases in mainline Protestant churches. Evangelicals are kind of holding steady. And part of that certainly can be attributed to the fact that many of the virtues, worldviews, right? Evangelicals have had a powerful impact on America. So they kind of are comfortable there in that position of mainstreamness. But other than that, groups come and go in acceptability, viability. It wasn't that long ago when Americans, when asked, said that they would rather have an atheist president than a Muslim. And that has shifted in the last 20 years. So these kinds of moments of who is considered acceptable or not acceptable, I think we're going to see shifts, and I don't expect it to stabilize anytime soon.
As the spiritual but not religious community grows, as the agnostic and atheist communities grow, do you feel it's likely that those people will begin to search out ways in which they can exist in community with one another outside of religious belief? I know there's this idea around, obviously, Unitarian Universalism. It's been around for a long time, the idea of a secular church or an agnostic church. But there are also new communities that have sprung up where they sing songs, they talk, they read books, but they don't have a scripture, they don't pray, they don't have sacraments. Do you think communities like that will grow in popularity, or is there no evidence for that?
You know, I'm not sure that these kind of alternative churches are going to be compelling long-term for many people, right? There's been a lot of attempts at this. Sunday morning fellowships where you get together and talk about Jesus over beer. There's a lot of attempts to kind of rethink what religious practice looks like. I think what we are probably more so going to see is not kind of alternative churches or religious communities, but people making their sort of complex identities in new arenas. So I'm thinking of things like fandoms, Jonah, where people go to Comic-Con not just to have fun and dress up, but to meet other people who are interested in similar stories, who want to talk about similar interests, similar questions. And that might seem kind of trite, but there's endless options for people to find others with whom they can share some kind of meaningful exchange. And I think one of the problems with scholarship historically, especially when it comes to religion, is that we have tracked a lot of data by counting cars in church parking lots. People aren't going to church, but that doesn't mean they're not out there asking big questions. They're not out there having conversations with their friends and their family and random strangers on airplanes. And those are the kinds of things that I'm more interested in, is how are people in new areas in unexpected ways continuing to live meaningful, thoughtful lives outside of that framing structure of institutional religion.
I think there's even evidence on Dickinson's campus that there are students who have attempted to do this. I mean, obviously in classes that focus on social sciences, there's lots of conversations that can involve meaning making for students. But outside of the classroom, we've also noticed there was a large pagan curious group that sprung up on campus, had fluctuating popularity and relevance, but certainly is extant at Dickinson. Interest in those kinds of conversations, at least in a regular group meeting form, does not seem to be huge, despite the large secular and generally, I think, very thoughtful population at Dickinson. Why do you think it might be that young people who are thoughtful, love having these conversations, struggle to actually bring those to bear in some kind of community focused on them?
I think that we're in this space anymore where, fortunately, asking people to commit to vulnerability with other people is increasingly a challenge. I think one of the things that I hope that I accomplish in the classroom is making people at least slightly more comfortable with at least talking about religion, religious difference, religious sameness, religious ideas, religious confusions, all of that. It does require a certain level of vulnerability. And as we we increasingly are in this place of tension and disagreement and outright violence, that becomes more of a challenge, but in some sense more essential, that we have the opportunity to do that. I don't know that I have a solution. One of the things that I've been working on probably about 5 years now is trying to integrate conversations around sustainability on campus with religious literacy. We are very comfortable talking about sustainability, environmentalism, where we are pretty much, this campus has all bought into that as a value system. So I figured, why not talk about that through the lens of religion as a way to get people more comfortable with those conversations. I think it's been effective. I think those conversations are happening a little bit more. If nothing else, more people are coming into the classroom for those conversations. Whether we're able to do that on campus, I think requires a kind of big picture, almost existential kind of moment of reflection about who constitutes Dickinson now and how we can kind of serve the community of people who are here to sort of start or continue this process of making meaningful lives.
I think that something that I notice in conversations that I have with students is that religious students don't know how to talk about faith to secular students, and secular students don't know how to talk about their own beliefs and experiences of religion with religious students. And so there's this real gap where I can find a Jewish student, a Christian student, a Muslim student, a Hindu student, and they're all willing to engage in good faith with each other, talking about similarities, differences, overlap within their communities and traditions. But the moment that somebody who is truly secular, doesn't have any religious background, enters that conversation, that everybody sort of clams up because the commonality is lost. And I think there's a very real fear among religious students, and not everyone, that the presence of somebody who has no faith in that conversation is an attempt to delegitimize their own faith. And there can be fear on the other end by secular students that engaging in vulnerable conversation with students of faith means openness to conversion, or means a conversation where someone's going to try to convince you to believe something. Do you have any recommendations for ways that students of faith and students of no faith can open up to each other without being afraid of the consequences of that?
We did a survey probably about 5 years ago on campus and asked students, questions related to their religious or spiritual identities, how important those things were to them. And we found that surprisingly, more than half of the campus, really closer to 70%, had some kind of religious or spiritual identity. They also indicated that they felt themselves to be in the minority. So this sense of feeling siloed, being the only one who thinks or believes like you do, this happens whether you're in the majority or the minority, it seems. My biggest suggestion would be that we have to individually have that courage to be vulnerable and choose the right people to practice that with. I think that we're very lucky to have a kind of campus where we have courses that facilitate these kind of conversations, but we also have so many different special interest groups and clubs on campus where people can choose the people that they want to sort of engage with. I think starting to have these conversations with people that you like and you trust is really the kind of foundational starting place. Don't have your first conversation about big questions with someone you know might be antagonistic. Build up that skill and that confidence. And I appreciate that comment you made about approaching these conversations in good faith. I don't know if you intended the pun, but the idea that people really are genuinely curious. I have noticed in the last several years that increasingly in conversation, any question is viewed as antagonistic. And I think we have to get away from that. We have to really start asking questions from a general place of curiosity and openness, but it's just up to people to start doing it to kind of change that social problem.
As a professor in the religion department for several years now, have you noticed that students generally have grown in religious literacy over the time that you've been here, or decreased in the amount of religious literacy they have, regardless of their own religious affiliation?
I'll start big picture here. The data shows that across the board, Americans know less and less about religion, whether it's their own or that of other people. Now, Dickinsonians are a special, unique group in the sense that simply by the fact of having access to college, they've had access to an education that informs them more than the average American. I would say that instead of loss of knowledge, what I've noticed decreasing in the last 15 years of teaching is cultural shift in the historical touch points of religion. When I first started teaching, I was able to use September 11th as this kind of historical turning point. And people would understand the referencing. But that's gone because most of my students now weren't alive during 2001. And so it has become a lot more challenging to kind of understand how a religion has changed very, very quickly in the last 50 years in particular, because students are just losing access to those reference points of historical moments. But knowledge, I would say, is probably stable.
Do you feel students are losing access to historical reference points, as you put it, because they're not being educated in religious community? Or do you feel that that is largely a result of the bombardment of media that we're experiencing and the lack of ability to sort of focus?
I think it's honestly more so the latter. Our unfettered access to information and also entertainment, which I classify differently, has done some things to our ability to take in, retain, and to synthesize information. And I think we can see that in the ways in which people are kind of disengaging from a lot of things that are demanding of them. One of the reasons that people will state for leaving a religion is because it had too many rules. It demanded too much. It expected too much. I couldn't do X, Y, and Z. And so the fact that we now have access to all of this information puts the onus more on the individual to filter and kind of focus on that. And if we don't have those skills, it becomes trickier.
Professor Vann, thank you very, very much for being here with us today on the CSSJ podcast. I look forward to continued collaboration with the religion department and to more great conversations with you and professors and students like you.
Thanks, Jonah.
And with our main interview with Professor Vann now behind us, it is time for us to move on to a time-honored tradition of the CSSJ podcast. That's right, folks. Up next is going to be the newsletter review. Now, Ajla, have you gotten a chance to review the newsletter for this week?
I now have, yes, I have.
And could you please enlighten our listeners as to who wrote the newsletter article for this week?
Why, it would be the one and only Jonah Lenahan.
It was the one and only Jonah Lenahan. Me, myself, I, sitting in Landis' house. Ajla, do you remember what I wrote about?
Vaguely.
You know what? Honestly, first week on the job, that's the best I can ask. So my newsletter article, for those of you disloyal listeners who have not read the newsletter, because you're slackers, was about the season of the church year that we're in. I'm talking about ordinary time, how I filled that time as a little kid in church, and then my experiences working as a church camp counselor, which I did again this summer. I was pretty happy with this article. Would you say it was a well-written article?
I would say so, yeah.
For a non-English major?
100%.
I was satisfied with this.
But you know who probably isn't satisfied? Likely Ezra.
Ezra, as you may know, is one of our coworkers, and I assigned Ezra the hopefully easy job of doing a polite, simple, gentle, kind review of my newsletter article for this week. This is a newsletter article, guys, that is close to my heart. I'm talking about my religion, my experiences in the outdoors. So I'm really hoping and expecting that Ezra handled this with care. What do you think?
Ezra picked it up, probably stomped it on the ground, and ripped it up to shreds.
Which is crazy because it's a digital newsletter. No, like if Ezra managed to step on a digital newsletter, she can say whatever she wants about me. That's expensive. You're gonna wreck a whole computer. Now, before we get into the newsletter review, I want to talk briefly about Gather Us In. As somebody who has joined all three Christian groups, this is an event that I do monthly with members of all the Christian groups or none of the Christian groups who want to come and talk a little bit about their faith, their experiences in the church, and maybe even do a little prayer and have some snacks together. So our first Gather Us In for this semester is going to be the last Wednesday in September. With no further ado, here's Ezra Sonkrant's review of my very first newsletter article of the season. Ezra, do your worst.
What's good? Ezra, live and alive here. Irreverent she, they. Jonah, I'm not feeling this one. Let's get right into this newsletter. So you start out with this portion about how the portion of the Christian calendar and talking about ordinary time. First of all, really bland start. I think it's kind of nerdy, and that's kind of what I'm feeling at first. Bit nerdy, because ordinary time, who cares? I don't care. You go down through this, you talk about candy sales for some reason. I have no clue. Second paragraph, though, this is where I start going from thinking maybe it's kind of mid to thinking, oh no. So you talk about how you start going to church camp in your summers. And then you say this, I joined the kitchen staff at 17 before becoming a counselor. My dream. So you're telling me that your dream as a kid was to one day become a camp counselor, a Christian summer camp. I'm sorry, but what a nerd. Not like a rock star, not astronaut, doctor, anything like that. Camp counselor? Ugh. Then you say all this stuff about like, oh, well, like what really made camp extraordinary was the people. You're in the middle of the wilderness. Start loving nature a little bit more. Get your head out of your app, as they say. All these kids on their phones all the time, enjoying their social media instead of loving nature, where you should be. It's so Christian hegemony of you hating nature. You hate nature, admit it. Then you say this. You end it off by talking about union. And I got real excited. Union? Oh, who's unionizing? I found out we're unionizing against you. You're not even our boss, but we should be unionizing against you because of how awful this is. You say it's about union. This wild, foolish, clumsy human love for the person next to you, blending their self with yours? What a mischaracterization of the power of people. How awful of you to say that people are wild, foolish, and clumsy? That's awful. Humans are much better than that, and that's not what union's about at all. Then you say that, oh, people are so disconnected nowadays. That's not even true. People are not disconnected at all. Everyone's so connected nowadays. You say that, like, no matter what words you use, the ailment dividing us from each other is real and persuasive. Nuh-uh. And it makes our lives blander. And then you say this really got me. Spiritual community is the interruption. To what? Blandness? You're such a nerd for hymns that you can't get it through your head. Then you end it with this. Peace, Jonah. Peace? Peace. Peace is the opposite of anything that is harmonious and good in the world. In the words of the great Alan Watts, peace is not what you want within harmony, but what you want is conflict. Conflict to flow and happen as it is an actual part of harmony. And with that, I gotta say, you get a D- from me. I could have given you an F, but you are on thin ice, buddy. And I gave you a D- because I'm giving you grace. So watch out. You got one more chance, and that's it.
Well, Ezra, I respect you as a person, and I'm really glad that you work in the office, but that was seriously rough. I'm kind of upset. Isla, how are you feeling?
I might need some tissue.
Okay, you're obviously faking that, okay? You have to be more subtle when you're pretending to feel a certain way on the podcast.
I was trying to get an Oscar for my performance.
Oscars don't work for podcasts, right? That's not for podcasting.
They could. We could be the first one ever.
Did you hear that, Oscar? You're judging us now. It's not just for movies. Anyway, thank you, Ezra, for at least making a thoughtful contribution to this podcast. Jeez. It's very important to hear from different perspectives. And this was something that was always emphasized to me ever since I've been at the CSSJ, by older staff, by our previous director. And while sometimes that criticism or that contentious conversation is hard to take, as I have just experienced, it's very, very important. And sometimes even when perspectives don't straight up disagree with each other, it's still good to hear from both. Another way that we balance perspectives here at CSSJ and at the podcast is that we like to have students and faculty on to talk to us. And we've just heard from Professor Vann, we've just heard from a student worker, Ezra Sankret, and now it is time for us to hear from somebody else.
Today for our second interview, we will have Fatima Siddiqui. She is a current junior here at Dickinson College, and she represents Muslim students on Mecca's board as the vice president. She is studying to hopefully be in the medical field someday, so she'll do great things with her great mind, inshallah. She's an amazing person to talk spirituality with, as I've personally learned much from her, and I look up to both her character and her mannerisms. Today we'll talk about what Islam means to Fatima and how we're able to expand on the Islamic faith here at Dickinson. Without further delay, I'm delighted to have Fatima with us, and I hope you're able to learn something from her as well. Hi folks, thanks for sticking around with us so far. I'm now joined by Fatima Siddiqui. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ayla. I'm happy to be here.
So give us a rundown. Where are you coming from? What's your faith like?
Faith-wise, I was born into a Muslim family, which came from Hyderabad, India. So there was like a large Muslim community there that sort of shaped my parents' understanding of Islam. And then they migrated to the US for college, and from then, I was born in Detroit, Michigan. And then from there, I feel like I've traveled like all over the world. So I don't really consider myself, even though I've lived here for more than 5 years, I don't consider myself a local to anywhere because I feel like I still hold like a piece of every country that I've gone to.
I actually didn't know that about you. I didn't know that you were born in Detroit. So what other countries did you go and like live in, or even states? Like where'd you go?
So when I was born in Detroit, we lived there for a little bit, and then we moved to Illinois, and they had my sister, and then we moved to Canada for 5 years, and my brother was born there, and then from there we went to Saudi, and then we lived there for about like 6-ish months, I think, and then things weren't really working out there in terms of my parents' job, so we moved back to Maryland, and then we lived there for about 5 years, and then we came here.
Oh my gosh, so you've really been like all over either the globe, but that's actually really interesting. Wow.
Yeah, I feel like that kind of shaped my perception of not necessarily religion because I was a bit too young to understand that completely, but in terms of like culture, I feel like I've witnessed so much and I've embraced so much. Even like being to India during the summers, I feel like I still hold a piece of that, and I think I just like in my mannerisms and my behavior, I still like do things that don't necessarily seem like I'm a local to Pennsylvania.
Right, or even fit into the American status quo. For anybody listening, I'm using air quotes. Having moved to central Pennsylvania, I want to hear what your experiences are like with your faith and how you felt moving into a community that your beliefs were maybe slightly more foreign to. I know I went to Boiling Springs High School, which is just down the road, super small school, predominantly white and Christian. So I want to hear a little bit about you having gone to Cumberland Valley, correct?
Mm-hmm.
What was that experience like over there?
So it's really interesting because when we moved to Pennsylvania, I was at a point in my life where most people are at that point where it's like high school is this milestone where they really become exposed to like a whole bunch of different people, and their self-identity changes and nothing really remains the same after that. Prior to that, I was always just kind of doing whatever my parents told me. I was following their guidance, and then when high school came around, because I was faced with all these different cultures and all these different beliefs, I was forced to introspect on my own. And I realized I didn't really know the foundation of anything, any of the practices that I'd held up until that point. And so I was faced with a decision, and that was that I either do my research and I realize that I agree with what I was raised to do, or I depart from that and I find my own identity in something else.
Right.
I feel like it's made me such a better Muslim, and it has made me feel that it's much easier to practice my faith when I understand the context in which I do those actions, and like I'm able to also spread that kind of guidance to those around me, not necessarily even in a religious sense, but just being able to inform them of what Muslim culture holds and the kind of beliefs that we actually hold.
I don't think I could have said it better myself. That was really beautifully said. Fatma, tell us a little bit about Mecca, the Muslim Educational and Cultural Association here on campus. Was there any first initial gut feelings that you had about the club itself whenever you first arrived? And do you think it's changed a lot since?
It's definitely changed a lot. I think my initial feelings towards Mecca are summed up in my first interaction with them, which is me sending them an email asking if there's anywhere I can pray on campus, and then me getting an immediate response saying that this email is no longer valid.
No way, really?
That was my first impression. And so after that, I was like, I wasn't even sure if Mecca was a thing, or if like I was just being gaslit up until that point to believe like, oh yeah, there's like a thing, but we're never gonna show you where it is.
Wow.
I remember like doing the orientation, first coming to campus, and like Rahma chased me down. She's like, oh my gosh, another hijabi. That was the first Muslim I'd met up until that point. And then after that, I went to like the first Mecca meeting, and I was like really excited, but there was like bare bones, like nobody was there, and I was just kind of like awkwardly like, again, I guess this is it. I mean, I should be grateful for whatever we have here. I didn't really identify with Mecca up until that point because I was like, there's not really much going on. I just knew there were events with food, and those were the most popular ones.
Right, like during Ramadan or stuff like that. It was just the only reason people would show up was because of food. And a lot of times, even the people who did show up, they weren't necessarily Muslim or learning about Islam. They were just there to reap the benefits.
Right, which is fine in and of itself, but I was looking for like a center in which I could foster my own religious beliefs and build connections with those who had similar beliefs to mine. And unfortunately, I didn't find that immediately. And especially when college is a place where you spend so much time, it's important to have a community where you can like kind of safely hold your own beliefs. Belief is born in a person, but it's fostered by a community. And without the community, then the beliefs remain like underdeveloped. So I'm really excited to be the vice president of Mecca this semester because I feel like I am now able to enforce the changes that I wanted before, and I'm able to be a part of the movement where we try to branch out more and try to build more connections within the campus itself.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
I'm so happy to be working with you on the Mecca board this year. There's definitely a lot of potential with our leadership, so I'm really excited to be working with you as well.
I know, Mecca wouldn't be anything without like the competent people who are currently existing within this community.
Do you feel that there's any structural or institutional challenges that you see for Muslim students on campus, even for yourself? So I know we've kind of glossed over this question a little bit in the past, whenever you mentioned the email, which I honestly think that's insane.
It sounds ridiculous. Yeah, and my mom, I read the email to my mom and she was like, huh? She was as flabbergasted as I was.
Right. And so given that structural challenge, do you feel that there's any other ones, such as access to the prayer rooms?
Yeah, so in my experience, from either hearsay or from witnessing it myself, the meditation room isn't exactly the most meditative place always, and sometimes it's locked as well. Sometimes it's being used for things that it should not be used for. So in my own experience, when I was coming to campus, I would never really expected being given anything. I was sort of the mentality that like, well, it is what it is. I just have to adapt to my surroundings.
Which is so unfortunate given that students of faith are really overlooked in general, whether that be people who are devoutly Christian, people who are devoutly Jewish, or people who are devoutly Muslim for the Abrahamic faiths. That we may not constitute the majority, but we at least want something. We want some sense of belonging or some sense of being shown that we are supposed to be here. And something as small as a prayer room being used as the meditation room, but really it's taken advantage of by people who shouldn't be using it in the way that they do.
I mean, like, I remember coming into the meditation room one evening, and there was this person who was just straight up knocked out on the couch. And I was like, okay, it's fine. He's exhausted. So I prayed, and then I left. And then a couple hours later, I come back, and that same guy is still knocked out on the couch. And at that point, I wanted to check his pulse.
See if he was, like, actually passed out.
Yeah.
What message do you have for students like yourself on this campus who have come from places where they may not have been accepted for their faith, spirituality, or lack thereof?
I guess my message would be do your research and foster your beliefs for yourself first and foremost. Because, I mean, I meant what I said before, that faith is born within a person and it's fostered by a community. If there's nothing within the person, then the community cannot help them. But then also, it's very lonely to be the only one who holds a certain set of beliefs in an alien environment. So I would say do your research, first foster your relationship with God, and then look for other people who kind of help you to, like, I guess exercise that love for God.
Right. You want to surround yourself with people who are looking for not just your best interest in mind, but also their own interests. So you want to foster that community with each other to push each other to do better.
And in my experience, because, you know, there was a very small percentage of Muslims on campus when I first came, I met so many non-Muslims who, they were so loving, of course, and they were so accepting of my practices, and I felt safe praying in front of them, which is, you know, a wonderful feeling to have.
Something that I want to add is during the encampment that Dickinson College had, Muslim students were praying outside. They formed a small line of a barricade between us praying and the street nearby. So in case there was anybody who wasn't in agreement to us praying outside, we at least had a literal human barricade between us and them. And that's something that I thought was so beautiful that I'm talking about it now and I'm getting goosebumps. It was such a beautiful moment, and we did that with community members nearby. And that's something that I can definitely attest to, is that Dickinson is filled with absolutely loving students for the most part, I would say. Everyone's very open to hearing different perspectives. And I think that's the beauty of the quote unquote small liberal arts college, that everybody's willing to at least hear somebody out.
That in particular was such a beautiful display of unity. And I hope, like, maybe not in the same pressured circumstances, but I hope we have more opportunities to display that love for one another and be in an environment in which we can, like, you know, talk about our beliefs very openly and not feel strange for the beliefs that we hold.
In the spirit of first years arriving on campus, and this being our first podcast of the season, and your first time being on the podcast, what's one piece of advice that you would give to the younger you?
That discipline pays off, I guess. Not just in terms of schoolwork necessarily, but I remember in high school, a lot of my time was spent learning the benefits of delayed gratification. The idea of, like, you don't have to necessarily always fulfill, like, the satisfaction of getting something done. Sometimes, of course, we're not always in the best moods. We have periods of depression. I think everybody does. But even in those periods, the idea of, like, me just laying in bed and not wanting to do anything, and then I realize it's time for prayer and I have to get up, that forces me to get up, and that forces me to, like, you know, wash myself and feel like a fresher person. And I realize not necessarily doing what I initially wanted to do and being forced to have some sense of discipline actually pulled me out of that rut that I was in. It helped me build, I guess, defense mechanisms, and even, like, mechanisms in which I can self-regulate in terms of learning about delayed gratification, but also being able to do things that are hard and being able to be independent in an environment that's completely different from me. So now if I don't have a space to pray, I'll pray, like, outside, and I won't care who looks at me, because it's my thing at the end of the day, and I'm not doing anything to anyone.
It's between you and God, and not between you and anybody else. And there's nobody else more important to judge than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's not somebody whose judgment is more important than him. So I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
And I think it also helps other people to see, like, I mean, prayer is really the core of Islam. And, like, I've heard a lot of good experiences, or, like, beneficial experiences that people have had seeing Muslims pray in public, and for them to witness a complete lack of, like, consciousness of what the general public thinks. I feel like it does good even if it doesn't benefit their relationship with God. It does benefit the self to know that you are allowed to practice something that's completely different from everyone around you.
And that closes out our interview with Fatima Siddiqui. Any last final remarks that you have for the podcast?
Yes, we're trying to, as a group, as an organization, Mecca is trying to have a bunch more events on campus this semester. We'd love for everybody to come from all different varying backgrounds and identities and personalities and whatnot. We hope to really foster that interconnected relationship that we have within our campus this semester.
Ajla and Fatima, thank you for that interview. As the guy who listened to it about 10 times in the edit, I know I learned loads.
What a great start. I'm more blown away than the leaves on Morgan Field in October. Professor Vann gave us an in-depth view of American spirituality.
And then EdSub invited us to engage with the Africana Studies Department in exciting new ways. I'll definitely be partaking. Hopefully there's food.
And Fatima led us into the rich world of Islamic spirituality with humility and kindness, and I'm so glad that she could join us.
And Ezra ripped me to shreds in the newsletter review, suggested the staff overthrow me, and attempted to usurp not only my leadership role, but also my entire spiritual identity.
Okay, Jonah, relax. We can handle the outro.
Oh, by all means, Ajla, lead the way.
Follow the Instagram. We'll be posting regularly about campus events, podcast recordings, and so very much more. I'm about to revolutionize the public face of CSSJ, and we cannot wait to collaborate with our other friends in DEI and more.
Oh, and Religiously Redefining and Dickinson Taoists are changing the way we think about religious and spiritual life. There are places for the spiritual but not religious, the agnostic, the atheists, and the nuns. You're all invited.
The service opportunity at Community Cares is bringing our student groups together to do something for the people who have the least in Carlisle, my hometown. Social justice is in the name, and we're getting better at making it mean something.
Well said, student workers. A new season begins and the glory of fall approaches. Religious, secular, and spiritual life here at Dickinson is a whole world of discovery. This is the time to jump in. Allison Organ, play us out.
And now, a message from the director of the Center for Spirituality and Social Justice.
Filling in for the director-to-be, this is EdSub Tay. This episode of the CSSJ podcast is brought to you by Professor Jodie, known for my cult following Vann, whose insights into religious expression has taken us way beyond the norm and made us question whether there was a norm to begin with. Also special thanks to Fatima, the Veep Siddiqui, for a thoughtful commentary on Muslim life at Dickinson. Much appreciation to Jonah, Walmart Run Anybody, Lenahan for his thoughtful interview questions and rabid ecumenisms, and to Ajla, Smash That Computer Salkic, for juggling Mecca leadership and a hard-hitting student interview at the same time. An honorary mention to Ezra, Christian Hegemony Watch Songkrant, for her rampant and much-needed criticism of would-be homilist Jonah. Speaking of the devil, hey Jonah.
Etsub, did you get that newsletter formatting thing out of the teams that I told you to get?
Would you prefer pickled green beans or pickled broccoli?
Okay, green beans are sacred in my family. My dad was raised on a green bean farm, ergo, I have to say broccoli.
Ooh.